Hi and welcome to Knit with Hannah. I'm Hannah, I'm here with Knitting Nat to help you knit with ease, confidence and joy. We're talking reality checking knitting patterns today. Sounds a bit weird. But there was no real other word for it. It's basically what I'm trying to say, and I'll explain why obviously, is that you can't knit every knitting pattern. Some of them probably aren't knittable. And that's just for some knitters. Other knitters will be able to knit it, and then other knitters will think of it as not something I really want to knit. That's what I'm trying to get to today. You know you as a knitter. And I'm not dissing knitting pattern writers. What I'm saying is that you can find knitting patterns that work for you. So let's actually take a look at knitting patterns. Like I said, I'm not going to shame knitting designers, so I'm not going to actually show you knitting patterns. I'm going to talk about knitting patterns generally, and I want you to realise that you can look at all of these knitting patterns and go, that's realistic for me, that isn't. And I think there can be a lot of, maybe comparisonitis does come into it, but there's a big draw to say, oh, well, I'm not a very good knitter because I can't knit that then. Is the knitting pattern, surely I should be able to knit it. I know that that's how I felt for a lot of the time, before I found confidence in realising that I was a decent knitter. I was knitting by myself, there was nobody else around me knitting, and I had no real idea about whether I was a good knitter or not. I thought because there were a lot of knitting patterns that I really didn't want to even contemplate, that I was a bad knitter. Not the case. I think it's the knitting patterns that kind of have this unrealistic balance between knittable knitting patterns and unknittable knitting patterns for the majority of knitters. So let's talk about that today. It may feel at some points that I'm getting quite negative, so that's not the intention. The intention is to say what is realistic and what isn't realistic. And we're going to talk about how you can actually assess those patterns first, and how you can look at them and go, yeah, okay, so that's just not for me. And then we're going to look at knitting patterns and say, this is where I can find ones that will work for me and that do feel knittable, and I can feel confident about knitting thanks to these knitting patterns. So let's first talk about how it is that some knitting patterns just are not given to you and produced for knitters in a realistic knitting way. Let's first look at knitting pattern books, and they do come in two varieties. Firstly, there's the books from the manufacturers that kind of go, yep, here's your yarn, go and get a whole bundle of it, and these are all the knitting patterns you can knit with it. It's a very similar way to the way that they produce leaflets. So you get a single pattern. You can bet most of the single patterns will be found somewhere in books. It's just convenient. If you only want one knitting pattern from that book, perhaps it's available as a single pattern. Very likely it is with a lot of them. The other way books can appear, it could be, like I've got a few. I've got the Harry Potter book, I've got an Outlander book, there are Disney books, there are so many knitting pattern books because there's knitting in that particular TV series or in a film or something. Someone says, okay, we have to make a knitting pattern book of this because everyone's been asking and making fan fiction knitting patterns from them. So they are the kind of books that you'll get. This is the yarn, or this is the theme. And you will have a strong publisher behind them who will have proofed everything. They very likely already have knitting editors who go through the patterns and proofread them for mistakes. There are occasionally mistakes in knitting pattern books. It's not surprising. It just happens. There are mishaps and print errors and typos in a general book that you buy if it's been published for the first time. It will have gone through testing, it will have gone through pattern checking. That's a great thing. They're also going to use, very likely, established designers. That's another good thing. They know how to write a knitting pattern, and they're very likely niched in a particular style of knitting or a particular garment that they create. So they are written by expert knitters. Good. Some expert knitters may have forgotten what it's like to be a beginner. And like I said, I'm not naming names, but sometimes those barriers and the lines that you cross between, that's a beginner pattern, Are you sure about that? Are you sure about that? There are some lines that just kind of feel sometimes that they're getting cross, and they need to be written down as intermediate or advanced beginner. So that's one thing to be taken note of. The other thing is to think about the photographs. These have not only been photographed by experts, they're worn by models, so they're people who know what to do. They've got a lighting team who make sure that it's in the right light and it hangs properly and everything looks great. So it looks like an absolute brilliant knit. You're never going to wear that every day and say, cool, yeah, I look like that model, don't I? Look at that. No, it's not going to happen. But the other thing is, all of the samples in the books are knitted by expert knitters. So a beginner knitting pattern knitted by an expert, advanced, beautiful knitter, everything they do is absolutely on point, on tension, everything's right. If a beginner knits that pattern, it may not be as good. So just realise that the reality sometimes of the knitting patterns in books aren't quite the reality of the knitter who's going to knit them. And that's okay. We just need to reality check that and go, oh, it's not as good as it looked in the book. I'm really disappointed. Probably a reason for that. You're not standing there with expert lighting as you look in the mirror and you put it on in the morning over your jeans. So, yeah, that's certainly something to think about when it comes to knitting pattern books. Let's take a look at the books that are made for fans of a particular genre. Oh, I love Outlander, let me find all of the knitting patterns. I love Disney Beauty and the Beast, let me find all of the knitting patterns. That kind of thing, they're going to be in books somewhere, I would imagine. I know I've got the Outlander book, but I'm not talking about that in specific. I'm just saying that this is the kind of book that you're going to find. You're going to find knitting patterns in there, and they're given to you by skill level. And like I said before, that skill level can sometimes kind of be broached a little bit. It's probably not quite on par with your average knitter. Your average beginner knitter may be able to do this, but may not be able to do that, even though it's labelled as a beginner knitter pattern. So just remember that too. And even the intermediate and the advanced, they can be completely off key. Do you feel like that knitter who, because they're just a knitter, is a beginner at cables, an intermediate when it comes to lace knitting, and you're really advanced at colour knitting, and you are really advanced when it comes to beginner, easy stitch pattern knitting? You love that kind of knitting, that's your Netflix knitting. So you are already mixed up all over the book. You can't just say, I can knit all of those beginner patterns, I can knit all of those intermediate patterns, I can knit all of those advanced patterns, because you'll be a real mixture of them. So take note of that yourself when you're looking at this kind of book. Where are you within the different genres of knitting? There's so many out there. There's so many different types of knitting that we do on a day-to-day basis. Where are you within those little niches? And if it's a stitch pattern you've never come across before, you're going to have to sit down and practice it and kind of go, okay, do I get this or don't I get this? Do I even like this? Or have I started this and bought all the yarn and kind of gone, oh no, this is crazy, I hate this knitting pattern. Just because there's a particular stitch in it that really annoys you and gets frustrated. It may even break your needles or give you pain in your wrist or something. That's come to a point where, in my experience, I've had to look at lots of moss stitch in a big jumper, or 50 different cables across the back of a jumper, and I know I can't do that because my wrist and my thumb gets cramped and pained, and I just can't do it. That's just who I am as a knitter. So I go, yeah, they're great. I'm going to go and buy that off a shelf somewhere, and I have done this year. I absolutely love cable patterns, jumpers. So I bought myself a cable jumper this year because it's complex. It's far more complex than I could ever knit, and I love it. So that's just the way it is. But you will know you when it comes to knitting. You will know you when it comes to different genres within knitting. Be aware of that as you're looking through the books. If it says at the beginning, 10 of these patterns are for beginners, just make sure that 10 of those patterns are your beginner knitting, not someone else's beginner knitting. And I'm going to be honest with you now, when I've gone through some of these books, it's felt to me like these fan books can feel like there's 50, maybe even 80% of the knitting patterns that really aren't knittable by your general knitter. They would take a lot of focus, a lot of concentration. And if you think, oh, there's 12 patterns in that book, I can knit them all up in a year. It's going to take you years. And by the time you've knitted a couple, you'll be bored of it and you just do not want to knit anymore. And that's what I've found in these, is that you really need to be a massive fan of this type of pattern to say, I'm in, I'm knitting it. If you want a whole wardrobe of things from Beauty and the Beast and you get the Beauty and the Beast knitting pattern book, then go for it and get everything up. But for me, it feels a bit more like a coffee table book. Like I would flick through a cookery book in an afternoon, just because I'm sat there on the sofa and I feel like it. Feel inspired by it. I look at those things and I feel, oh yeah, I fancy making vegan sausage rolls. Yeah, that'd be nice. And then have I ever got round to it? No, because I looked at 15 other patterns within that book and thought, oh, I fancy knitting them. I've picked up that book so many times and thought, oh yeah, I fancy knitting 20 of those recipes. But have I ever cooked a couple of them? Maybe. But not all 20. Because I'm not that dedicated to that particular cookery book and that particular cook who's made that cookery book. So it does, a lot of these feel like you're going to sit on your coffee table, you might knit one pattern. Go into that with reality, with a reality check on the pattern and a reality check on why you got the book in the first place. Also, please be aware when you're looking at books, especially with the fan books, you may have different words and different jargon in there that you've ever come across before, so you're going to have to take time to look it all up and make sure that you've got the right translation. There also will very likely be yarns that you just got no idea where they came from. You've never heard of them before. They're very particular to, I don't know, a particular state in the US or a particular country in Europe, and you know where you can get hold of it, or it's just not available anymore. Then that's another reason why some of these fan books just aren't available to the general knitter. You'd have to substitute yarn that's quite a complicated yarn to substitute. So that's what I've found too. Just reality check them. Look at them and go, is this knittable or isn't it? And it's okay if it's not. You'll find something else that feels knittable. Just quickly about knitting magazines. I've had people email me before with, I can't knit this pattern, what's going wrong? And it's from a knitting magazine. So it's, even especially if it's an older magazine that they just picked up off a shelf, it's chopped up into columns. And there's photographs all around it. And sometimes you can't tell which bit of the pattern comes first. Also, if it's in a knitting magazine, they're squashing it onto a single page, or it's over a few pages because they want so many photos and it's the pattern of the week or the month or something. And there will be abbreviations, more abbreviations than you would expect in a normal knitting pattern. Magazines can do that. Just be very aware of that. So it can be over multiple columns and you've got to find the right bit next. It can also be abbreviated to the point where it feels really unknittable. Some magazines are a lot better than this than others. If they've got all of the photos and all of the articles right at the beginning of the magazine, and then all of the knitting patterns at the back, then the knitting patterns are really well laid out. It's sometimes even better than it is in a book. So go for them. I've really loved those kind of magazines. When I've picked up knitting pattern magazines, that's what I'm getting. I very rarely get the ones where it's all over the place, because I have found too much struggle with them, just a little bit at a time. We can find knitting patterns that feel knittable and relatable to us as a general knitter too. As I've said, some knitters will be really focused and will actually want to go through a knitting pattern book for a particular reason and go, I need to know everything I want to knit this pattern, and I'm spending all of my time doing that. It will take focus, it will take concentration, it will take determination, and you have to see it to the end. But if you don't want to knit like that and say, crikey, this is a difficult pattern, I've got to get through it, I've got to get through it, I've got to get through it, you can knit with more ease and take more time with it. But you can also say, no, I'm going to leave that, I won't knit that. It's just not for me. So let's find knitting patterns that are relatable and realistic to you as a knitter. Find reviews, find recommendations from friends. You might find reviews in shops or from your local yarn shop. I love knitting this knitting pattern. It was great. It was so easy to knit. Maybe the final item doesn't look like it's easy to knit, but the pattern makes it so easy. That's what I love about it. A review, a recommendation from a friend is a great way to go. Remember, you are your own knitter. Like I said before, you may be a beginner at cable, you might be an absolute fabulous knitter when it comes to lace, and you may have no skills at all when it comes to colour knitting, and it's not something that you want to do at all. You may have never picked up knitting socks, or you may be a really advanced sock knitter. All of those different things will tell you who you are as a knitter. So look at the skill level and the abbreviations list for every single pattern that you want to knit, that you think, oh yeah, I'm slightly drawn to that, let me have a look, let me have a closer inspection. As soon as you find a photograph that you fancy, don't say, I'm knitting that. Look at the skill level, look at the abbreviations list, and there's one more thing. Read through the knitting pattern. Before you even commit to yourself to buying the knitting pattern and buying the yarn, read the knitting pattern and say, does that make any sense to me? Or if it's a complete gobbledygook, then I need to find something else that's similar where I can read the pattern. Because some knitting pattern designers just write in a different way. It's just the style of writing knitting patterns. I found that sometimes that some designers just don't work for me because the way they write knitting patterns just doesn't seem to work in the way that I knit. So that's okay. That's fine. No problem. But most knitting patterns are knittable if you understand them. And unfortunately, that's the thing with knitting, is that if they're writing something and it sounds far too confusing, you just have to leave it until you've had that bit more experience. That's okay too. Put it on your shelf. So I'm having that, but I'm knitting it in 2 years' time or in 6 months' time when I've had a chance to understand what that means a bit more. Third thing is, if you're looking at a, say, cardigan, you've got button bands, you've got to knit the neckband or the collar, take a look at the knitting pattern, because if you're put off by that, oh no, I hate picking up stitches, I don't want to do that. You never know, once you read the knitting pattern, it may happen as you're knitting. It may have nothing to do with picking up stitches at the end. So all those little things that you're really put off by because it looks like that on the photograph, just double check. There are knitting patterns that don't do that. It's all knitted in one go. It just happens. Some top-down cardigans, they start with the collar. You knit the collar first. Yay! And you're on circular needles, so you haven't got a seam at the sides. Yay! Some knitters will love that. To be perfectly honest, I'm not bothered either way, because I'm quite happy to do either thing. But yeah, you know you. Don't dismiss a pattern. It actually might be very realistic. Now, this is something, I have mentioned it before, but it's certainly something to look at when you're looking at realistic knitting patterns. Try one new thing at a time, or maybe 2 new abbreviations in each pattern. Unless you are a very competent, focused, like I've said before, if you're really focused, if you're determined to learn everything you need to learn to knit this particular pattern, and I've seen knitters like this, I really have. I don't know how to knit, I barely know how to knit, but one of the first things I'm knitting is that brand new cable jumper for my husband, and it's going to be finished soon and done, look at it. That's because they sat down and said, I really have a vision for this. This is coming off my needles and I can imagine my husband wearing it. That's going to be amazing. Perfect. If you have that passion inside you and you want to do that, great. But most knitters will sit there and go, you know what? I'm happy to do that in 5 years' time. Let me learn a bit more about cabling first. So learn one thing about cables at a time. Do it. And then pick up another pattern and go, okay, well, I understand cables a bit more now, so maybe I'll learn 2 new things about cables. Great. All of those little things you can learn one at a time. And that's what makes patterns generally realistic and knittable. And of course, I said this before, I'll say it again, knit from established designers and from designers you've knitted from before because you know you like them. You've knitted these knitting patterns before from this particular person, go for it. Keep knitting them. Keep loving them. And just keep getting their knitting patterns. There are hordes of fans within Ravelry forums, on Instagram, who go, oh yeah, I'm having your new pattern. Oh yeah, I'm having your new pattern. Because they love that kind of knitting. So why not? If knitting is something about your life that you absolutely love, then just keep doing it. And knit things that make you happy. Knit things where the pattern doesn't feel too tough. You might learn new things as you're going through different patterns, and that's okay. But if you don't want to explore a great deal of designers, then just keep knitting from the same people. Yeah, it makes things very knittable and it makes things realistic when you're picking up a pattern. When I have picked up knitting patterns from knitters that I've knitted from in the past, from using yarns, using all sorts of different things that feel okay, that feel just right, that's when I feel like a confident knitter. I feel like someone who can knit things and actually get experience from it. When I was young, I picked up that knitting pattern with a cable jumper on it. I wasn't married, so it wasn't for my husband, it was for me. I was really enthused and kind of passionate about it, and I thought, this is going to help me learn about cables. And it wasn't until I'd knitted the back and thought, you know what, I can knit cables now. I'm okay with that. I don't need to finish knitting the jumper. That was the reason why I started knitting it. It wasn't the jumper that made me start knitting it. It was because I wanted to understand cables. But knowing that gave me so much more confidence as I kept on knitting. I absolutely love knitting cables from then on, and I still do. So what is it that makes the difference? I wanted to pick that knitting up regularly. And after I'd knitted that, I wanted to pick up knitting more regularly too. I wanted to learn new skills because I'd already done that, and I thought I was just a general knitter. I had no idea I could do anything like that. Okay, I'm interested. What else could I do? What else can I learn? What other things are there inside me that I never imagined I could do? So I became even more creative and I learned more about knitting. And it began to feel like a really important part of my life. I really appreciated all the parts of knitting that were not just, I'm finishing that. I'm getting to that point and I've finished a project. I'm using or wearing what I finished knitting. It was a part of my life, just like every other creative hobby that I had in my life at that point, where I could really appreciate it without having so much, oh, this is difficult knitting, I've got to do it. I feel confused and scared when I'm doing knitting. There was none of that. It was all, I love knitting because it gives me so much ease. I feel confident with it. I absolutely love it. I love holding the yarn. I love the fact that I can just knit and feel that meditation going through me as I'm maybe watching the telly. And it's that rhythm. So all that confidence just happens as you're knitting. So how can you find that too? As you knit from patterns that you're confident in knitting, that feel so much more realistic and feel knittable, you're going to feel more confident. You're going to feel that you want to pick up your knitting more regularly. You're going to really start to recognise the benefits of knitting that are right there, underneath the fact that you've finished a project or that you've been knitting something for a while and you're seeing a real progress. Or that what else you're going to do is you're going to want to learn new skills because you realise, oh, actually I learned something new in this pattern. Maybe I can learn something else in the next pattern. The idea of learning more because you feel more invested in it and because you're doing it more regularly will actually feel quite natural. If you want to explore your knitting and want to feel that you are confident as a knitter, then guess what? The confident knitter could well be what you need. The confident knitter is a 30-day dive into finding out who you are as a knitter, what it is that makes you tick as you're knitting. And it is delivered in a form of podcast. So if you like podcasts, you're on. And you get one every day with little tasks or little ways to look at your knitting as you're knitting that day. There might be a video that day as well. So many little things are just dripped in over the 30 days that will make you feel a lot more confident in your knitting and feel that you can knit and really enjoy it as a valuable experience in your life. And you're not only going to find the courage, the accessibility, the confidence, you're going to feel that ease and the calm and the relaxation as you're knitting as well. Do hope you'll join me in that. That is available over in the Academy. I'll leave the link below. You can go and have a look at that. I'm going to leave the link below for slow knitting. This is going to talk about how you knit, the ways that you knit, where you knit, and also about how you can bring relaxation into your knitting more often and that ease and calm too. Thanks so much for joining me today. I'll see you again soon. Bye for now. Happy knitting. There was a fly just moved in front of the camera then. What?